Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Barjina, Assistant Professor, GMC Anantnag. I'm going to present cerebrum. Now, what is this cerebrum? It is the largest part of the brain, which is present in the skull. As you can see in the picture, it is ovoid in shape. It is ovoid in shape, and it has two hemispheres. This is the left cerebral hemisphere, and this is the right cerebral hemisphere. These two hemispheres are being separated by means of a fissure. This fissure is called as the medial longitudinal fissure. The contents of this medial longitudinal fissure are the falx cerebri, which is the modification of the dura mater, then the pia mater and the arachnoid matter. This falx cerebri separates two cerebral hemispheres incompletely. They are being joined beneath by means of commissural fibers called as corpus callosum. Then the cerebral cortex, as we have taken the coronal section of the cerebral cortex. In this section you can see the cerebral cortex is being covered by means of the gray matter. This gray matter is called as the cerebral cortex. This gray matter has various convolutions in the form of elevations called the gyrus and in the form of depressions called the sulci. Within this gray matter you have the central core of white matter. You have the central core of white matter with scattered nuclei, gray matter nuclei called as the basal ganglia. Then the various features of the cerebrum are that it has three surfaces, three poles, three borders and four lobes. For the poles, we have the frontal pole, as you can see in the pic. It is blue colored, and the frontal pole is blunt. Then we have the occipital pole, which is pointed, and we have this green colored, what you can see in the pic. This green colored pole, this is the temporal pole. This green colored pole is the temporal pole. Again, in the next pic, you can see this is the frontal pole, which is blunt. This is the occipital pole, which is pointed, and this is the temporal pole, which is projected downwards and forwards. For the borders, you have this is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the half of the cerebrum. We have taken here the half of the cerebrum. This is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the superomedial border. Superiorly, we have only one border, that is the superomedial border, and inferiorly, here you have the inferiomedial border. Other picture. This inferiomedial border is further divided into two, that is the medial orbital border and the medial occipital border. Medial orbital border and the medial occipital border. Then inferiorly you have one more border, that is the inferolateral border. The anterior part of the inferolateral border is called as the superciliary border. For the surfaces, we have three surfaces. This is the superolateral surface, this is the inferior surface, and this is the medial surface. Inferior surface is further divided into two, that is the orbital surface and the tentorial surface. Orbital surface is related to the orbit. We have four types of sulci which are seen in the cerebrum. That is the limiting sulci, then you have the axial sulcus, you have the operculated sulcus, and you have the complete sulcus. Talking about the limiting sulcus, what is this limiting sulcus? The example in front of us, we have the central sulcus, which separates two functionally different lobes, two functionally different areas. That is, the limiting sulcus is the sulcus that separates two functionally different areas. It separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Then we have the axial sulcus. Axial sulcus is the sulcus that grows in the axial line in the rapidly growing homogeneous area. Posterior part, this is your calcarine sulcus on the medial surface of the cerebrum. This calcarine sulcus, its posterior part forms your axial sulcus, and its anterior part, it forms your operculated sulcus. Now what is this operculated sulcus? Operculated sulcus is the sulcus which in superiorly it comes into connection with some other area, and inferiorly it comes into connection with some different area. For example, for the anterior part of the calcarine sulcus, the depth of the calcarine sulcus is associated with the visual area, and the surface of the calcarine sulcus is associated with the peristriate and parastriate areas. These are the secondary visual areas. Then you have one more sulci. Sorry, it is the same example of the, see, this is the calcarine sulcus, which is the example of the operculated as well as the what I said, axial sulcus. Then you have the complete sulcus. This is the example of the complete sulcus present on the inferior surface of the cerebrum. This is the collateral sulcus. This collateral sulcus raises an eminence in the lateral ventricle called as the collateral eminence. Then we have the different lobes of the cerebrum. These lobes are, we have frontal, we have parietal, we have occipital, and we have temporal. For the sake of the distribution, these areas are distributed by means of two imaginary lines. One line extends from the parieto-occipital suture to the preoccipital notch. One line extends from the parieto-occipital suture to the preoccipital notch. This is the parieto-occipital suture, which is present on the medial surface with a little bit extension on the lateral surface. This is the first line. Second line is the continuation of the, this is the lateral sulcus, posterior limb of the lateral sulcus. Second line is the continuation of the posterior limb of the lateral sulcus, and it meets the first imaginary line. Now the first, that is the frontal lobe, is separated from the parietal lobe by means of one of the important sulcus of the cerebrum, that is the central sulcus. Then the parietal lobe is being separated from the occipital lobe by means of the first imaginary line. The parietal lobe is separated from the temporal lobe by means of the second imaginary line. These are the various lobes of the cerebrum: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. You have two more lobes we can include in this. One is the limbic lobe. Limbic lobe comprises the, you have subcallosal, this is the corpus callosum. Then you have subcallosal sulcus, and you have the cingulate sulcus, which are the part of the limbic lobe. Then you have one more lobe, that is the insular lobe. Insular lobe is the area which is just beneath the lateral sulcus, posterior limb of the lateral sulcus. It is that part of the cerebrum which during development doesn't grow at a pace, at a faster pace as compared to the rest of the areas. So it is also called as the hidden lobe. We were talking about the superolateral surface. This is the superolateral. So we will be today discussing the superolateral surface. This is the superolateral surface of the cerebrum. As you can see in the frontal lobe, you have three sulci. You have three sulci. This is the precentral sulcus. Precentral sulcus is present just in front of the central sulcus, and it is parallel to it. Between this precentral sulcus and the central sulcus, you have a gyrus called as the precentral gyrus, or it is called as the motor area. Anteriorly, just anterior to the precentral sulcus, you have two more sulci: superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. This is the superior frontal gyrus in front of the superior frontal sulcus. In between the two sulci, a middle frontal gyrus, and inferior to the inferior frontal sulcus, you have interior frontal gyrus. Then this is the parietal lobe. In the parietal lobe, you have postcentral gyrus, which is just behind the central sulcus. We have postcentral sulcus, which is just present behind the central sulcus. and it is again parallel to it. This in between them you have post central gyrus, which is the sensory area. Then we have intraparietal sulcus here, which divides the parietal lobe into supraparietal lobule and the infraparietal lobule. Here, talking about the central sulcus is one of the important sulci of the cerebrum, and it just ends above the posterior limb of the lateral sulcus. Then talking about the temporal lobe. In the temporal lobe, as you can see, you have one of the important sulci, that is the lateral sulci. This is the lateral sulcus, which arises from the inferior surface of the cerebrum and goes upwards on the lateral surface, superolateral surface of the cerebrum, and has two limbs. This is the anterior limb, this is the ascending limb, and this is the posterior limb. Anterior limb, as you can see, and ascending limb, both they just get into the matter of the inferior frontal gyrus, and hence this area is called as the pars opercularis, and this is called as the pars triangularis. This is called pars orbitalis, sorry. This is called pars triangularis, and this is called as the pars opercularis. This is the pars orbitalis, pars triangularis, and pars opercularis. These are the limbs which protrude into the inferior frontal gyrus, and the areas formed are pars orbitalis, pars triangularis, and pars opercularis. Then in the temporal lobe we have this superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus, separating the three gyri: superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. Fine. Then the posterior limb of the what I can say lateral sulcus covers the superior temporal gyrus superiorly. All these three sulci, they end up posteriorly in the inferior parietal lobule, and the area of the inferior parietal lobule overlying on the superior temporal this posterior limb of the lateral sulcus is called as the supramarginal gyrus. Then the part of the inferior parietal lobule on the superior temporal sulcus is called as the angular gyrus, and the part of the inferior parietal lobule over this inferior temporal sulcus is called as the arcus parieto-occipitalis. I will repeat it here. You have the this is the posterior limb of the lateral sulcus. It goes upwards and ends up in the inferior parietal lobule. Then you have the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. They again end up in the inferior parietal lobule, and the area of the inferior parietal lobule which is just covering this, here it is called as the supramarginal gyrus. It is here called as the angular gyrus, and here arcus parieto-temporalis. Then this is the occipital area. In this occipital area you have three type of sulci. You have transverse occipital sulcus, then you have the lateral sulcus, which divides the area into supraorbital gyrus and the infraorbital gyrus. Then you have the lunate sulcus, which is moon shaped, and it is just present at the tip of the occipital lobe. Then this is the insula. This is called as the hidden area of the cerebrum. This hidden area of the cerebrum, this is being covered by the rest of the parts of the cerebrum. During development, the growth of this insula is less as compared to the rest of the areas, so it remains hidden under these areas. Then it is being surrounded by the circular sulcus and covers by the frontal operculum, then frontoparietal operculum, and the temporal operculum.